tonight we are talking LambCrop. So tonight's kind of theme is increasing output, and we're really going to showcase on triplets tonight. So we've got a year where a lot of scannings are reporting high scannings, where there is a lot of multiples given. It's triplets and quads this year. So I think it's a great time to really home in on the pre-lambing management of these, as well as the behaviour as we go into lambing as well. Um, Tonight we're funded by the University Innovation Fund, and we have two fantastic speakers with us tonight, where we've got Kathy and Tim joining us. So we are going to start off first off with Kathy. So I don't know if Kathy, if you want to bring up your screen as I'm just introducing you. So many of you will know Kathy's name, face and voice, I'm sure. She's an excellent speaker. She's a researcher with SRUC. And what Kathy doesn't know about sheep behaviour and welfare isn't worth knowing, I would say. So Kathy, I'll hand over to yourself.
Great. Thanks very much, Kirsten. Good evening, everybody. It's really nice to be here and talking about behaviour, of course. I'm not sure I would agree entirely that I'm sure there's lots of people know all sorts of things about behaviour that I don't know, but it is an area that we do a lot of work in, and I find completely fascinating. So hopefully I can share some of that with you this evening. I think, as Kirsten said, going to focus on triplet lambs. And so I'll talk a little bit about the behavior and biology of triplet lambs, and that's sort of focusing on some of the work that we've been doing here in SRUC over the years. Sorry, that's also the lambs and their mothers. So obviously thinking about what the ewe has to achieve and how she might do that, as well as the lambs, and thinking about some of the barriers or opportunities to improve their survival. And then the second part of what I'm going to talk about is some work that was done by a PhD student looking at different ways of managing triplet lambs, in particular a survey that she'd carried out with farmers in the UK, Ireland and New Zealand, looking at some of the different practices. And then I'd just sum up with a few sort of suggestions, I guess, for how to deal with these larger litters. So some of you might have heard me speak before, and you might know that really the focus of a lot of what we do when we think about the behavior is trying to understand how we can achieve this, which is a rapid intake of sufficient colostrum, so that transfer of colostrum from the mother to the lamb. And this is absolutely fundamental for survival for three main reasons. Of course, it gives the lamb nutrition, and sufficient nutrition to allow it to be able to do all the other things it's supposed to do, particularly preventing starvation and hypothermia, particularly in the very young lambs. Excuse me. It also plays some other roles. So quite an important one from a behavioral point of view. It plays a role in how the ewe and lamb bond with each other, especially the lamb. So it keeps the ewe wanting to show maternal behavior when the lamb suckles. But actually, it's also an important mechanism that allows the lamb to learn to recognize its own mother in the flock. So that obviously prevents mismothering if the lamb knows who it's supposed to be going to. And it keeps the bond close so that the lamb and the ewe pay attention to each other. And that can reduce the risk of accident and predation as well, particularly if lambs sort of get wandering off and get lost. And then the third main function of intaking colostrum, of course, is that passive transfer of immunoglobulins. There's also other secretions in colostrum that are growth factors that speed up the closure of the gut. And so that can also prevent large macromolecules like bacteria getting into the animal's bloodstream. So it can also have an impact on reducing the risk of infectious disease. So really a key thing to try and achieve, whether you've got singles, twins, triplets, quads, is that they get that rapid intake of sufficient colostrum. So when we think about what the animals might need to achieve or carry out the behaviors they need to do to achieve that, from the mother's side, we look at some of the different behaviors that the mother does, particularly around licking, making those low pitch bleats or rumbles, allowing the lamb to come to the udder, not being aggressive towards her offspring. And those are all part of how she forms a memory for the smell of her own lamb. And that's an important part of the bond. So the mother is selective So she will recognize her own lamb from its smell, and she'll allow that lamb to suckle, and she won't let any other lambs that she doesn't recognize through that smell memory, it won't let them suckle. So if a ewe doesn't allow her own lamb to suckle, that can be because she hasn't formed this proper memory for the smell of that lamb. From the lamb's perspective, we look at how active they are, how quickly they get to the udder and suckle, and whether they are competent, so whether they're able to show that change from coming from inside the ewe to being able to take over regular breathing, and in particular, being able to maintain their own body temperature. And if these behaviors from the mother and the lamb are successful, then we have this mutual recognition where both the mother recognizes her offspring and the offspring recognize their mother, and they maintain what we'd call spatial proximity. So they'd be close to each other, attentive to each other. The ewe responds to the lamb's calls and vice versa. And the mothers are more vigilant and pay attention to other things, just so that sort of aspect of taking care of their offspring. So these are the sort of behaviors that we would typically measure in any of our studies. And so really the question that we sort of asked is, well, what happens when we've got 3 lambs? What does the ewe do? How does she cope with the fact that she's got 3 offspring? So the data I'm going to show you is behavioral observations that we've collected over many years on about 500 or 600 ewes and lambs. So we've got quite a lot of detailed information on what these animals do. So this shows us what the ewe does in terms of how much licking and grooming does she do over the 2 hours after the birth of her last lamb in a litter. And we look at this in sort of 10-minute blocks, and what proportion of that 10 minutes is the ewe spending licking. And you can see that the singles in blue, the twins in orange, and the triplets in gray. And you can see actually the ewes do pretty much the same amount of licking and grooming no matter what size litter they have. And there's sort of an upper limit that you can't do any more than spend all her time licking and grooming. And so she doesn't have a lot of opportunity to increase that amount of grooming because she's got more lambs. We do see a little bit more grooming after about an hour after all the lambs have been born in the ewes with 3 lambs. But there's not a lot of opportunity for her to show more licking and grooming because she's got a bigger litter. But if we split that out by how much per lamb is the lamb getting in terms of licking and grooming, you can see that the single lambs, so that blue line, are getting a lot more licking and grooming over those 2 hours after birth than a twin or a triplet. But there's not a lot of difference between twins and triplets. So the ewe is having to sort of portion out her maternal behavior. How much time does she spend licking across whether she's got 2 or 3 lambs or more. And she does show more licking and grooming for the first lamb, which is perhaps, again, not that surprising. So you can see lamb 1 in blue, lamb 2 in orange, and lamb 3 in gray. And so the gray lambs, the third born in a set of triplets, is always going to get quite a lot less licking and grooming and cleaning and tidying up from its mother compared to the other members of the litter, at least until more than an hour after it's been born. And the second born lamb also gets more maternal attention. So the ewe is dividing up her amount of time she can spend licking and grooming across her different lambs, but it is the first lamb that tends to get most of this, because we do see a decline over time with how much licking and grooming the mother does. And that's not particularly related to how dry the lambs are. So it's much more related to some of her own physiological responses, how much time she'll spend on licking the lambs. And these bars show us how much time the ewe spends making different sorts of vocalizations. So the orange bars are those low-pitched lambing rumbles. And there's not really an impact of having 1, 2, or 3 lambs on how many of those she does. She still makes a lot of those vocalizations all the time after the lamb is born. The other sorts of vocalizations are the louder, high-pitched, open mouth vocalizations that the ewe makes. So sometimes that's about calling a lamb to her when it's got further away. Those low-pitched vocalizations she often makes when she's licking or letting the lamb suckle. And we do see, even though they occur at a much lower rate than the low-pitched rumbles, she does make more of those if she's got a bigger litter. So that, if you like, is a reflection of how hard it might be to keep her litter together when she's got 2 or 3 lambs. So there's some small differences in maternal behavior, but we don't see enormous differences in how the ewe responds when she's got more than 1 lamb to look after. And so some of the things that we think about is, does it really matter when we see these quite small differences? And we know that the ewe is able to form a separate bond with each new lamb. So that licking, even when she's not licking the third lamb nearly as much as the first, she's still able to form a bond with that lamb. And the ewes do form a separate bond with each lamb. So it's not that she learns the taste of one lamb or the smell of one lamb and then she can that means you can recognize everybody else. She needs to make a new bond. Each lamb smells a little bit different, and she has to form that bond or that recognition of each lamb. But she's certainly able to do that when she has 3, even with a smaller amount of licking and grooming. And it does seem that she's able to count up to at least 3. So in studies where we ask the ewe to distinguish between her lambs or to recognize different lambs, or lamb that's her own and a lamb that's not her own, she can do that for each of her lambs. And we do see that the ewe will wait until she has all 3 lambs with her before she'll move off. Or if she's only got 2 lambs, she will go looking for the 3rd lamb. So she is aware that she has 3 lambs and knows that she needs to go and find them. So from that perspective, those small differences in how much behavior she's showing don't seem to have an effect on how well she can form a bond with her lambs. But it is true that the lambs do get less attention. So the licking and grooming that the mother does, as well as helping her form a bond, also helps dry the lamb and keep it warm. And so some of those lambs, particularly the 3rd lamb, are going to be wetter for longer. And that can have a consequence for how well they can regulate their body temperature. And we know that this is more difficult for inexperienced ewes to be able to properly separate out the fact that they need to feed or look after or pay attention to different lambs. So this is something that more experienced ewes find easier, but when a ewe is giving birth for the first time, this can be something that's a little bit more challenging for her to be able to do this efficiently. But overall, we can see that the ewes are able to look after 3 lambs and able to form a bond with each of them. So some of our other work then looked at, well, what does it mean for the lamb? What are the consequences for a lamb of being born as part of a litter of 3? So we and others, and this has kind of been reliably shown by lots of people, have shown that the gestation length of a triplet litter is shorter than for singles and twins. It's not enormously different, but on average, it's about a day and a half shorter if the ewe is carrying 3 lambs rather than 1 or 2. And again, I'm sure that you would all know this anyway, but again, very reliably, we see that singles are heavier than twins and heavier than triplets. And at least in our studies, it's about a 1 kilo reduction with every increase in litter size. So these lambs are being born a little bit earlier, potentially maybe a little bit more immature, and they're lighter compared to smaller litters. And across many, many studies, very reliably, people have reported that triplet lambs have lower survival than other litter sizes. So these figures come from a study that looked at nearly 30 different studies that had looked at survival in different countries, different breeds. And again, you can see that there's about 10% loss of singles, about 15% loss of twins, but we have this much bigger drop off in survival when we get to triplets. So only about 2/3 of triplet lambs will survive. And that's, again, something that's seen across many, many different studies. So really, triplet lambs are much, much more vulnerable. They're lighter, they're maybe a little bit immature, and they have this big loss of ability to survive. So several studies have shown that those higher losses tend to occur on day 1. And we know that's the time that most lambs are lost anyway. But if the lambs are then artificially reared, they can have a similar rate of survival as artificially rearing a twin or another lamb. But those losses tend to go on for a little bit longer if they're reared by the dam. And there's a suggestion that this can be because some ewes don't have sufficient milk to be able to feed 3 quite as well. There's also a sort of behavioral component to this, because obviously the ewe only has 2 teats, and she tends to, after about the first week, she tends to only let her lambs suckle when they come together at the same time. So if you have twins, you'll see that the ewe will let both twins suckle at the same time, but often she won't let one suck on its own. When she's got triplets, she'll let 2 suckle and not the third. And then the third will then have missed a suckling opportunity. And they have to compete a little bit more between each other as well for that opportunity to get to the udder. So even if the ewe can make enough milk to feed 3, there's competition between the triplets to access the udder. There's a really important impact of birth weight here. So being a lighter lamb as a triplet lamb, and we see this in the activity of the lamb at birth. So what this, I'm sorry, it's a very brightly colored graph, shows us is that the behavior in orange is the lamb getting onto its chest and starting to gather its feet after birth. Standing is the time the lamb first stands, and then in pink is the time it takes the lamb to suck after birth. So the bigger the bar here, the longer it took the lamb to get up and suckle. This is the average birth weight, and these are lambs that are 1 or 2 standard deviations smaller, so the lightest of the lambs, and these are lambs that are getting heavier on this side of the graph. So you can see that when the lambs are very light, it takes them a lot longer to get to the udder and suckle, and as they get heavier, their time to get to the udder and suckle gets quicker. There is a little bit of an uptick with the very heavy lambs that's often related to the fact that these animals have a more difficult birth process, and that can make them a little bit slower to get up. But overall, we know that low birth weight lambs will take longer to stand and seek the udder than heavier lambs. Again, with that little bit of an increase in time with very heavy lambs. And that having an optimal birth weight improves lamb vigor. And so there's a very strong connection between the birth weight of the lamb and how active and vigorous it is in terms of reaching the udder. So we know in triplet lambs that they take longer to stand up, slower to stand up, and slower to suck after birth than either twins or singles. In fact, they take nearly twice as long to suck after birth. And of course, some of that is related to being these light, low birth weight lambs, but that's not completely the answer. So if we have a triplet lamb that's the same weight as a twin, the twin will on average suckle more quickly than the triplet will. And some of this is related also to the ability of the ewe to get not only nutrition into the fetal lamb, but also oxygen through the placenta. And so these lambs are more compromised than just because of the impact on their birth weight. We also see that triplet lambs have a lower average rectal temperature over the first 24 hours after birth, so they find it more difficult to maintain their body temperature after birth compared to a twin or a single. So triplet lambs are slower to stand up and suckle. They're less able to maintain their body temperature. They're lighter on the whole, so that means that they have a greater surface area to body weight, and so therefore they lose more heat than a larger lamb would, because they've got this larger surface area, and they have less ability to mobilize body reserves to keep themselves warm. They're also slower to suck from their mothers, so again they're slower to use that the fats and proteins in the mother's milk to allow them to keep their body temperature up. As we saw, the ewes are not able to groom all lambs quite as much, so they'll probably be wetter for longer, which also means they tend to lose more heat into the environment. We do see that triplet ewes have less protein in their colostrum and milk, but they do produce a bit more fat, so that might be a partial way to help the lambs increase their body temperature as well by producing more fat in the milk than a ewe that's got singles or twins. So I guess putting all of this together, there's really good evidence that triplet lambs are more vulnerable. They're more vulnerable to being hypothermic for all the reasons I've already talked about. They're more vulnerable to starvation because they get to the udder more slowly. So even if the ewe is very cooperative and happy to lick and groom her lambs, the lamb still has to get up and get to the udder on its own. And we know that takes longer in triplet lambs. So they have, and being slower to stand up also means it takes them longer to learn to recognize their own mothers. And so they're also more susceptible to mismothering or getting lost. So although lots of triplet lambs can survive, we know that it's part of the lamb's biology that makes them more vulnerable to all the causes of lamb mortality that we would see, particularly on the first day of life. So the second part of the work that I wanted to talk about was a survey that we did looking at how we might manage triplet lambs. What sorts of things do people currently do? Is there some best practices and things that we can learn from what other people do? So this was a survey across the UK, Republic of Ireland, with the help of Tim, who's our other speaker, and with the help of Sue McCord in New Zealand and Ag Research. And so we had about 450 responses from sheep farmers and who answered all sorts of questions about what they did on their farm, particularly around what they did with their triplets. So I don't know whether some of you in the call might have taken part in that survey. So when we looked at the sort of demographics, what sort of farms were people farming? And if you split them out between our countries, you can see that clearly the UK and Irish farmers who responded were much, much more likely to be lambing indoors than our New Zealand respondents. So about 75% of the Irish farmers who replied were lambing indoors, about 2/3 of our UK respondents, but only 5% of New Zealand farmers. Perhaps not surprisingly, this also maps almost exactly onto the size of the flocks that people were managing. So our New Zealand farmers had more than 2,500 ewes. Our UK farmers just over 500, and our Irish farmers just over 200 ewes. So again, big difference in different farms in terms of the size and whether they lambed inside. But actually, there was much less difference in some of the other things that we asked them about. So their scanning percentage, for example. I know it looks like it's a little bit down in New Zealand, 176, but there was quite a bit of variation in there. So it doesn't look to be that much different to our Irish and our UK farmers who had almost exactly the same scanning percentage. Similarly, in lambing percentage, there was a tendency for UK farmers to have a slightly higher lambing percent than Ireland and New Zealand, but it wasn't, there's quite a big variation between different farmers there as well. And when we looked at lamb losses, and that was all the way through from scanning to 12 weeks, so not necessarily just lamb losses at, on the day of birth, but also losses that might have happened at stillbirths and abortions. Again, it looks like it might be a little bit higher in New Zealand compared to UK and Ireland, which were about the same. But that wasn't quite significant, again, because of these big, the big variation between farms. And then these are the data that the farmers gave us for how many of their flock, what proportion of their flock was triplets. And we did see a higher proportion of triplets in our New Zealand respondents than in UK and Ireland. So what we were looking at were farms that were quite productive, but quite a big variation in how that was managed, whether you were lambing indoors or outside, and how many animals you might be managing. So one of the questions, again, where we saw quite a big difference between our respondents was when we asked them how they manage those triplet lambs. And so you can see over here that our New Zealand respondents were far more likely to keep all the triplets on the ewe than either the UK or Irish respondents. and they were much more likely to adopt one triplet off onto a single bearing ewe usually, or a ewe that had lost her lambs. So again, it sort of reflects the indoor-outdoor nature of the farming that we were seeing, but it was this very big difference in how the New Zealand farmers would go about managing their triplet lambs. So it was much more common for the ewe to rear all 3 lambs than it was in UK and in Ireland. We also asked them which lamb would you remove? And overall, more than half the respondents said they would take the lightest lamb in a set of triplets. And that was particularly so in the UK and Ireland. So again, it may be thinking about which lamb is it going to be easiest to adopt onto another ewe. Taking the lightest might be the sort of thinking behind that. Whereas in New Zealand, although quite a few farmers did take the lightest, actually the medium-sized lamb was the most popular choice for a New Zealand farmer. And a small number of farmers said they would take the heaviest off a set of triplets. And only about 5% would say they would take the weakest, but that was actually more common in New Zealand. And again, that might be because it's much more likely that the ewe is going to try and rear all 3. But perhaps when there's a very weak lamb, then that would be removed in New Zealand, as sort of accepting that the ewe is not going to be able to rear that very weak lamb. So there is some variation in that kind of choice around which lamb should I take. And sometimes perhaps some of these reasons for choosing a particular lamb can be about matching the size of the lamb to the ewe's own lamb, particularly if we are trying to foster a lamb from perhaps a triplet lamb that may be 2 or 3 days old to a ewe that's just giving birth. Then having a small lamb or the lightest lamb will match more closely to the ewe's own litter potentially, and that may be more successful. In general, when we're fostering, I think I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I'm sure you all know that the wet foster techniques are more successful rather than putting the ewe in stocks and hoping that she's going to take a lamb. So anything that works with the ewe's own biology, which is really about forming a relationship based on smell and making the foster lamb smell like the ewe's lamb or like something that she can form a bond with, is much, much more successful. A much higher chance that the ewe will accept that lamb. And I just added a comment in here that we know that fostered or adopted lambs have higher mortality than the ewe's own lambs on average. And a lot of the times that is because we are trying to force the ewe to take a lamb rather than thinking about how the ewe forms a bond. And if we can use those understanding of the ewe's biology, then we're going to be much more successful in rather than trying to fool her into or persuade her to take a lamb she doesn't really want. If we can make her think it's her own or it smells like her own lamb, obviously that's why skinning a dead lamb works as well, because the ewe learns that smell or has learnt that smell, and she's responding to the smell that she recognizes. With our survey, we also looked at some of the things that we would consider best practice in how to manage the triplet lambs and ewes. So putting them into individual pen after birth to allow that, to prevent some of that mismothering and have the best chance for the ewe and lamb to form a bond. Knowing that triplet lambs are really vulnerable to hypothermia is making sure that they have access to shelter as much as possible, either inside or outside, but really being aware that they're very vulnerable to hypothermia. Knowing that they're going to be slow to suck, and so they may need more assistance to suck. If we can hold them at the udder and encourage them to suckle, that is a more natural way of the ewe and lamb learning to recognize each other. That is a bit slow in triplet lambs, so the more that we can do to help them learn to recognize their mother, the better. Giving the ewes colostrum as the preferred supplement rather than other things, because again, that helps the lamb form a bond, but also it allows all the other biological processes to take place. And again, because these lambs are quite vulnerable, inspecting them more frequently, just making sure that that bond is secure and the lamb is okay. And so from our studies, we well, from this survey, by scoring whether these things were management practices or not, we could show that those farms with the highest triplet lamb best practice scores also had both a higher lambing percentage, interestingly, but also higher lamb survival in our UK and Irish respondents. So carrying out these sort of key behaviors, key management activities were associated with improved survival. And our data seem to suggest that those farmers who had a high lambing percentage were doing these sorts of behaviors. So a sort of good recognition of the things that are needed to keep those lambs alive. So I guess just as I'm sure I've spoken for more than I should have done, but just the sort of some key take homes from the data really is being prepared. So I think what was interesting in our survey was when we asked the farmers if, do you want triplets or would you rather not have them? Then most respondents did want triplets. So that the sort of recognition that this could be a valuable resource, but also understanding that they're going to need more attention and more care. It sounds from Kirsten's introduction that everybody is scanning anyway, so you know what's coming. I think Tim is probably going to talk a bit more around this anyways, how you feed and manage those larger litter sizes, particularly during pregnancy. And we've already I've shown you some data already that shows that, you know, birth weight will be compromised and that has an impact on lamb behavior. And obviously improving ewe milk yield will help her feed more lambs potentially. From the behavioral work, I think just saying it again, really, I suppose, is that we know that these triplet lambs are going to be more susceptible to starvation, to hypothermia and mismothering. So I guess being aware that those triplet lambs are going to need more care potentially, and having an action plan to deal with those surplus lambs if the ewe cannot rear them herself. So I guess just being prepared at lambing time that if you've got a lot of triplets, they will need more support than singles or twins will. And I think that's all from me. Thanks very much.
Brilliant. Thank you for that, Kathy. A huge amount of information there. Really, really good. There has been actually quite a few questions coming in. I think Tim will actually cover off the majority of them with nutrition. But one that I thought was quite interesting to pull in just now, Kathy, was somebody was asking if they're lambing outdoors and they use lamb jackets, you know, the jackets to help for the weather and such like. Does the use of those actually prohibit some of that bond with the smell and such like?
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting question. I think so. The bond that the ewe forms is quite quick. So the ewe will form that bond often within half an hour of giving birth, or maybe an hour. So it's based on her ability to lick the lamb straight away. And then often, and you know, you'll see this all the time when the lamb goes into suck, she'll just sniff its bottom. So that can just be enough to, oh yeah, okay. So the ewe will recognize initially by smell, but after that she'll use a few other cues as well. So if you change the appearance of the lamb, I suppose, by putting a lamb jacket on it, there might be an initial point where she might have to have a double check that whether she recognizes it or not. But she's pretty good at using more than just one cue. So she recognizes what it looks like, she recognizes what it smells like, and she could often recognize what it sounds like as well. So she recognizes its bleat as well. So as long as she can use particularly that olfactory memory, that smell memory, just as a sort of quick check, really. So even if you don't quite look like my lamb, as long as she can sniff it, any part of it that still smells like her lamb, then it shouldn't have an impact on the long-term bond, because that is formed really early on. That's almost as soon as the lamb is born. So one of the ways that you might disrupt that bond formation is before she's got that secure memory for the smell of the lamb. If the lamb gets lost and she can't suck, or that smell gets contaminated by, I don't know, if we pick the lamb up and we've already got the wet smell of another lamb on there, we might disturb that licking part. But once that bit has passed, she's got a really secure memory for the smell of that lamb. And within less than 6 hours, the ewe will be very secure in that relationship. So even if she loses the lamb for a period of time, or we pick the lamb up and do something with it and put it back, she'll still know that that's the smell of her lamb, and she'll still recognize that lamb.
Brilliant, thank you. There's another question there, and it's around if we're going for the highest possible weaning weight, the lowest mortality, and the lowest feed use. When you're saying that the kind of the first day that the lamb is on the mother, survivability is lower. In your opinion, are you better than taking the triplet off and artificially rearing it? Or I guess a lot of it comes down to actually nutritional management and what she can actually cope with.
Yeah, I mean, well, I'm going to cover this probably, I'm not always coming at this from production focus. So it's always, I think, better for the lamb to be reared by you than by us. And that is definitely better from the lamb's biology, but probably often it's better, so excuse me, it's often better from a sort of work point of view as well. The ewe will do a better job of rearing a lamb than we will. But there is a risk around if the ewe is having to rear 3. I think, and again, I suspect Tim will talk to this as well, that if the ewe is well fed and capable and she's on good pasture, I think she can rear 3 very successfully. And we were seeing that with our New Zealand data. You know, most of those triplet lambs were being reared on the ewe, and the mortality rates were not massive compared to what we were seeing in the UK and Ireland. So most ewes, if they're set up right to do this, can do it themselves. I think if you've got a really mismatched set of triplets, and maybe you've got one very small one and 2 big bruisers, that little one is probably really going to struggle to get to the udder. And so those might be the times when it may be more beneficial to lift that one, or you've got a very weak lamb. But I think if you've got 3 fairly evenly sized triplets, they're using good nutrition, and you've got good grass to put in front of her, then she should be able to rear 3.
So really a case by case scenario depending on the ewe.
Yeah, and I think it's just being aware that, you know, the lambs are still going to be a little bit vulnerable. So if you've got nice sheltered pastures and things that the animals can make use of, that's going to help the lambs as well.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you very much for that, Kathy. There is more questions there for you, but I think we'll just make sure that I think Tim will cover off quite a lot of them. So if you can take down your screen, which you have. Tim, I think you're in business now. Have you got a camera working, I think, now?
Good evening, all. Thanks very much for the invitation to talk here tonight. Just having problems here with my mouse. To talk for the next half hour or so on maximising the potential from triplets, and I'll also cover a piece on ewe nutrition. So I suppose the first question I'd ask is, did you know that pregnancy nutrition is the foundation influencing profitability of grass-based systems of prime lamb production? Because it impacts on lamb mortality. Firstly, 60% of mortality occurs within 24 hours of birth. And when we're talking about mortality, we're talking about lambs that were born alive that died, and we're also talking about lambs that were stillborn. The second important point we want to talk about tonight is the number of lambs sold per ewe, because the number of lambs sold per ewe is the key factor affecting flock profitability. And we also know that as scan rate or prolificity or productivity increases, so does the number of triplets. And here's the mean litter size for different flocks going from 1.8 to 2 to 2.2 to 2.5. And in the other column is the expected number of triplets or quadruples you'd expect, multiple births. So if you have a flock scanning 1.8, you'd expect about 8% triplets. If you have a flock scanning 2, you're going up to 15. If you're a prolific flock scanning 2.2, you're gone to 25% or triplets or quads. And if you go to 2.5, then over 55% of your ewes will be carrying either 3 or 4 lambs. So it's important to try and maximize the output from these animals. So the first thing I'll talk about is fetal development, because this is a key issue. As Kathy alluded to earlier on, the mean duration of pregnancy is 147 days. The placenta is the first thing to develop, and that will be fully developed by day 90. The fetuses themselves don't develop until very late pregnancy, and during the last 6 weeks of pregnancy, there's a rapid growth in fetal development. 70% of the fetal growth occurs during the last 6 weeks of pregnancy. So, for example, if you take a single lamb at 6 weeks out from birth, it will weigh about 1.5 kilos, but at birth 6 weeks later, it'll weigh 6 kilos. If you take a set of twins, they will weigh about 3.5 kilos. 6 weeks out from lambing, but if you go out to birth, they weigh approximately 11 kilos. If you take a ewe carrying a set of triplets at 6 weeks out from lambing, she is approximately 3.5 kilos of fetuses in her. But at the point of lambing, she will produce about 14 kilos of fetuses. So it's very important that you get nutrition right. So when we talk about your nutrition, the main nutrients we're talking about are energy and protein, and nutrient requirements are impacted by the litter size, in other words, the number of lambs she's carrying, the stage of pregnancy, and her own body weight. And we've presented here, firstly, metabolizable energy requirements. And if you take 6 weeks out from lambing, a ewe carrying a single will require approximately 12 megajoules per day, whereas a ewe carrying triplets will require approximately 15. That's a difference of 30%. But if you come into 1 week prior to lambing, the ewe carrying a single requires 16 megajoules, whereas that carrying a triplet will require 25 megajoules, and that's a difference of 60%. So there's a big increase in the amount of energy required in the last few weeks prior to lambing. And if we talk about the stage of gestation or the stage of pregnancy, 6 weeks out from lambing, for a triplet up till the point of lambing, there's an increase in energy requirements of approximately 65%. So that shows a rapid increase in energy requirements in late pregnancy. And I've graphed them out here showing the ME requirements. As you can see, there's a dramatic increase, particularly for ewes carrying triplets and for twins. Similarly, if we talk about protein requirements, you can see that the big rapid increase in requirements in late pregnancy. There are different types of protein in terms of protein nutrition, and the first one is crude protein. And crude protein is a very crude measure. In other words, it's nitrogen multiplied by 6.25. So you can just take feed grade urea and multiply it by 6.25, and that'll give you protein. There are two main types of protein when you're formulating diets for any animal. The first one is called ERDP, and that basically is the protein that's readily broken down in the rumen, but can be captured by rumen microbes. And the second one is a fraction of the protein that bypasses the rumen, but is digested in the intestine, and that's called DUP. And these are combined together to form microbial protein. So let's look at the requirements. 6 weeks out from lambing, a ewe carrying triplets requires about 120 grams of microbial protein daily. The week prior to lambing, that's gone up to 171, or an increase of nearly 40%. And also, as you can see, that as pregnancy progresses, requirement increases rapidly, and as the number of fetuses increase, so does requirement. And again, it's graphed out on this slide, the requirements for triplets, a ewe carrying twins, and a ewe carrying singles. So on the next slide, what I've done here is I've put 3 graphs on it, and you think the 3 graphs were the same, except for I've changed the titles. This is for fetal growth, rapid increase in fetal growth in late pregnancy. Metabolizable energy requirements, a rapid increase in energy requirements to match the fetal growth. And then the metabolizable protein requirements, a rapid increase in metabolizable protein requirements, also to match fetal growth. So basically, there's a rapid increase in energy and protein requirements in late pregnancy, and you meet the requirements when you're doing your nutrition plan, or you face the consequences. So the second thing I'd like to mention would be birth weight, and Kathy also alluded to this, is that lamb birth weight has a big effect both on lamb performance, as I mentioned earlier, but also on lamb mortality or lamb survivability. We mentioned in the introduction that 60% of mortality occurs within the first 24 hours of birth, and 19% of these are due to dystocia. This graph is based on data from nearly 3,000 lambs from different studies that we undertook here at Athenry. And what we've graphed is the weight of the lamb at birth and the mortality on this y-axis. And as you can see, regardless of litter size, light lambs have a higher probability of dying. And as lamb birth weight increases, mortality decreases until you get to the optimum. And when you pass the optimum, it starts to increase again, most likely due to dystocia. So if you look at the red dotted line, and this is for singles, that as lamb birth weight increased, the mortality decreased to approximately 8% at an optimum, which was 6 kilos, and after that it started to increase again. For twins, as lamb birth weight increased, lamb mortality decreased when it got to the optimum of 5.6 kilos, and after 5.6 kilos it started to increase again. And when you look at triplets, the green line, you can see that lamb mortality decreased as birth weight increased, but once it got above 4.7 kilos, it started to increase again. So based on this study, our optimum from our survivability or mortality point of view, our optimum birth weight for a single is approximately 6 kilos, for a twin is 5.6 kilos, and for a triplet is 4.7 kilos. So most of the sheep, and as Kathy showed in her slides, that about 60% of sheep in Ireland are housed, and when they're housed, they're offered predominantly grass silage. And this is one of the number of studies we've undertaken looking at the effect of silage feed value. And I present, this is D value, these figures should have been changed. That's a 75 D value silage, and this is a 66 D value silage. And as you can see, as you increase silage D value, you increased meat intake from 12 up to 19 megajoules. You increase the body condition score of the ewes at lambing by 1 full unit, going from 3 up to 4. We increased lamb birth weight by 0.5 of a kilo, and we increased the weight of the lambs at weaning at 14 weeks or 100 days. We increased it by 1.9 kilos. So this response in an increase in weaning weight due to the quality of the silage that their ewes were fed in a grass-based system, the response in lamb weaning weight is equivalent to each lamb getting 19 kilos of concentrate from birth to weaning, which is equivalent to a saving of 14 euros per ewe, if assuming that the average number of lambs reared per ewe in your flock is 1.75. A summary of our data would show that each 5% unit increase in the D value of silage increases the weight of the ewe at lambing by 6 kilos. That's assuming that they were housed in mid-December and they're lambing in the beginning of March, so they're getting the silage for approximately 10 weeks. Body condition score by about half a condition score unit. Lamb birth weight by 0.3 of a kilo, and lamb weight of weaning by 1 kilo. This graph is what the level of concentrate we'd recommend for feeding ewes in late pregnancy that are offered silages differing in feed value. And these are D values going from 72 to 67 to 62. And these figures are for ewes carrying twins. Ewes, if they were offered precision chop silage, 72 D value would require approximately 12 kilos of concentrate during late pregnancy, whereas if they were offered 62 D value silage, they'd require nearly 30 kilos of concentrate. And the second thing to note on this graph is that as you increase chop length, you'll increase concentrate requirement, because chop length affects intake in sheep, while it does not affect intake in beef cattle or dairy cows. If you're using singles, you can reduce these figures by 5 kilos. And if you're feeding ewes carrying triplets, you'd increase these concentrate allowances by 8 kilos during the last 6 weeks prior to lambing. So we would recommend you group ewes according to litter size and expected lambing date, and you step up concentrate in late pregnancy to match requirement. We've also looked at concentrate composition, ingredient composition of the concentrate in late pregnancy, and this is an example of a study where we fed concentrates that were formulated to have the same crude protein and metabolizable energy concentration, but were formulated using different ingredient sources. The soybean concentrate, the protein here came predominantly from soybean, whereas the protein in the byproduct concentrate came predominantly from rapeseed, maize distillers, and corn gluten. And as you can see, when the ewes lambed down, there was no effect on body condition. These were two-tooth ewes. There was a small difference in lamb birth weight of 0.3 of a kilo in favour of the ewes offered the soybean-based concentrate. And at the point of weaning, the lambs from the ewes that were fed the soybean-based concentrate were 0.9 of a kilo heavier. So the response to the soybean concentrate was similar to offering 75% extra of the byproduct concentrate. And a lot of people, when they're purchasing concentrate, will look at price solely rather than looking at the ingredient composition. And if you're changing the price of a concentrate by 20 euros per ton, that's equivalent only to approximately 50 cents per ewe. And I think a ewe in late pregnancies can make it worth our while to feed it 50 cents extra. So when we're formulating concentrates, we look at the value of different feedstuffs that are on the market. And the main feedstuffs that we're interested in is barley and soybean, because we look at the value of other straits relative to barley and soybean. And here in Ireland at the moment, these are the prices that these straits can be bought for 10-ton loads left in your yard from different sources that I got recently. And what I've presented in the red is the straits that are very good value for money relative to barley and soya. And one of them is maize meal, the second is rapeseed, and the third is maize distillers. But we don't put much maize distillers in ewe rations because of the fear of copper toxicity. And from the previous study, we like to get a lot of our protein coming from soybean, whilst we'll also include some rapeseed. So based on the value of them concentrates, this is the composition of the concentrate that we're feeding at the research centre here this year, and also to a lot of commercial farmers in the region. And the concentrate we formulated this year is formulated to have a crude protein concentration of 19%. It has a metabolizable energy concentration of 30 megajoules per kilogram of dry matter, and it has a digestible undegradable protein concentration, or DUP, of 80 grams per kilogram dry matter, or 8% of the dry matter. And the ingredient composition is 30% maize, 18% soybean, 17.5% soya hulls, 10% rapeseed, 8% barley, 6% distillers, 5% bee pulp, 3% molasses, and 2.5% minerals. And when you're feeding, it's also important to have very good feeding management. And particularly for the last week to 2 weeks prior to lambing, these ewes will require a feed space requirement when you're feeding concentrate of 0.5 to 0.6 of a meter per ewe. And once we go above about 0.6 of a kilo, we'd recommend to feed it in 2 feeds rather than 1 feed daily. And some people do shear their ewes at housing, and there's many advantages to doing that. But one advantage is that they require a smaller feed space when they're shortened relative to those that are not shortened. So to go on now again and talk about triplets and how to manage them when you're rearing them, we'll just recap on the mean litter size of your flock and the proportion of ewes that you would expect to be carrying triplets. And if you're scanning 2, you'd expect 15% of the ewes to have triplets. And if you're scanning 2.2, you'd expect 25%. Someone has asked in the chat earlier on about getting the ewe to rear them, or would you artificially rear them? My preference is to get the ewe to rear them if at all possible, provided she is in good condition, she's got a good supply of milk, and she's 3 equally sized lambs. And we've done quite an amount of that here. And for example, if you do get the ewe to rear them, you're going to need more concentrate. And the additional concentrate that we're putting into a ewe rearing triplets is, firstly, she needs 8 kilos additional concentrate in late pregnancy relative to a twin bearing ewe to meet the requirements for the energy and the DUP and microbial protein. During the first 5 weeks of lactation, ewes that are rearing triplets, we give them a half a kilo concentrate per head per day plus good quality grass, and that gives you a total concentrate requirement of 18 to 20 kilos. And also the lambs that are being reared as triplets will get access to a creep feeder where we'll give them up to 300 grams of concentrate daily for each of our lambs up till the point of weaning, which is 100 days, and they will eat 20 kilos, consume 20 kilos each, or combined 60 kilos. And in total, a ewe that gives birth and rears triplets requires 85 to 90 kilos more concentrate, which at today's prices is equivalent to 34 euros to rear an additional lamb, which will give you a benefit to cost ratio of 3 to 1. There's one scenario, there's one caveat I must say, is that if you have ewes rearing triplets, they should be managed as a separate group within your farm so that the lambs can get concentrate and also the ewes can get concentrate. So what kind of performance do you expect from this kind of a system? And here I've presented birth type being singles, twins and triplets. And then I've the rearing type, born a single and reared a single. At weaning, we've got 38 kilos on average from our studies. If they're born as twin and reared as single, they're 34 kilos. If they're twin born as a twin, they're 31.2 kilos. If they're born as a triplet reared as a single, they're 32.5 kilos of weaning. And if they're born as a triplet reared as a twin, they're 30 kilos of weaning. All of these lambs would have been managed in a system where post-weaning, neither the lamb or the ewe gets any concentrate supplementation. Now, here is where we've got it born as a triplet and reared as a triplet. And this is where we give the ewes 0.5 of a kilo of concentrate for the first 5 weeks post-lambing, and the lambs have access to a creep feeder of 300 grams of concentrate per lamb per day up till the point of weaning. In that scenario that I described in the previous slide, the level of performance from the lambs reared in that kind of system as a triplet is the same as you'd expect from a lamb born as a twin and reared as a twin, where they had no access to concentrate. So basically, when you feed a small bit of concentrate, you can get good level of performance from triplet ewes, from triplet lambs being reared as triplets. So triplet born and reared, lambs born as triplets and reared were as heavy as twins born and reared using the current management system of 86 kilos of concentrate to the ewe and her 3 lambs. So some people then ask, if we're not going to rear them, what can we do with them? Well, the first option you have is to put them on done deal, and if your neighbours want to buy them at a good price, you can seriously consider it. And the second option is to artificially rear them. And if we're artificially rearing them, all lambs would require an adequate amount of colostrum. As I said earlier on, they require 50 mL of colostrum for each kilo of birth weight during the first 6 hours, and that needs to be repeated 4 times during the first 24 hours. If you're going to artificially rear them, we leave them with their mother for the first 24 to 48 hours, and then we remove them. We group them according to age and size. We supervise to ensure that they're sucking the teats. In an artificial rearing system, it's important to have very good hygiene, both in the pens, but also of the equipment being used to feed the lambs, because that's where you can transfer infection. And it's also vital to have access to clean water and concentrate, because your objective is to get these onto concentrate as soon as possible. So the different systems of rearing artificially reared lambs is the bottle. We've all done it. It's a pain. It's very labor intensive. It can be very cheap. It can keep idle minds occupied, but it's not for everyone. And I suppose if you've only got 3 or 4 lambs, you could possibly get away with it. And now there are also small feeders available that can feed up to 10 lambs, but you need to add the milk 3 or 4 times a day. You can get a lot of digestive upsets. It doesn't keep the milk warm, and there can be a higher incidence of mortality. Ad lib feeders have been developed, such as the one in the photograph here. They cost approximately €400. They'll hold up to about 50 litres of milk. They require electricity because of a heating element and thermostat. The milk is available 24/7 to the lambs. There's a low incidence of digestive upsets. You can get higher levels of lamb performance from feeding through an ad lib feeder. There's a small bit of labour required for mixing the replacer and cleaning it occasionally. And you can feed up to 4 different groups. As you can see, there are 4 teats, and you can group them off whatever way you wish. And the top of the range is to use an automated feeder, which costs about €4,000. It requires mains, water, and electricity, and fresh milk is mixed automatically as required. It has a low incidence of digestive upsets. It has the lowest level of labour requirement once the lambs are all sucking, and they can feed up to 250 lambs apiece. So this is the results of our performance of artificially reared lambs that we've got over a number of years. This is over 12 years here at Athenry. So lambs that were born as twins, when they're artificially reared, the average weaning was 32.5 kilos. Those born as triplets, their average weight of weaning was about 30 kilos, and those that was born as quads or fives, their average weight of weaning was approximately 28 kilos. So yes, they can perform fairly well. When it comes to weaning artificially reared lambs, I suppose the biggest issue is that the price of milk replacer is a major cost, and we were paying €70 last year for a 20 kilo bag of milk powder. We'd aimed to wean them at 5 to 6 weeks. Ideally, they'd be above 12 or 14 kilos. Ideally, they have to be over 35 days. And ideally, they're consuming more than 250 grams of concentrate daily. And that's why it's important to introduce concentrate earlier on and to get them consuming as much of it as possible. When we're finishing artificially reared lambs, there are two options. Finish them indoors on ad lib concentrate. It means that you need to bed a shed or else you have slats. And it also means that there's a high requirement for concentrate. Or you can finish them outdoors at pasture. And if you decide to do that, it is vital that you maintain them on concentrate. And I would be talking about feeding about 0.8 or 1 kilo of concentrate per lamb per day when they're at pasture up till about 14 to 15 weeks of age. So let's conclude. Pregnancy nutrition is the foundation of flock profitability because it impacts lamb mortality, lamb growth rate, and age of slaughter. It impacts yolk condition and lactation. And also, it impacts the grazing management post-weaning. For example, in the example of the study I gave with silage quality, there was a difference in the condition score of dim ewes at lambing of 1 unit. And at the point of weaning, there was a difference in condition score of 0.5 of a unit. That meant that the ewes that had been offered high feed value grass silage, if we maintained them at that condition, they were nearly fit to join the ram whenever they were joining the following October. Our data shows, on average, 5 percentage unit increase in silage digestibility increases the weight of the ewe at lambing by 6 kilos and increases lamb weaning weight by 1 kilo. When you're feeding concentrate in late pregnancy, the response depends on silage feed value. If you have very good silage, there's no benefit in feeding too much concentrate because all you're doing is replacing silage with expensive concentrate. We target a 19% protein concentrate, and we use concentrates that have high levels of ingredients such as maize meal, soya, rapeseed, barley, soya hulls, and bee pulp. It's important to develop a nutrition plan to meet your requirements, and to do that, you need to know the feed value of your silage. You need to know the expected lambing date from changing the rattle colours at the point of mating last year or due next year. You group them according to expected litter. You group them according to expected litter size, which you've got from scanning, and also to expected lambing date. Increase in litter size increases the number of triplets and quads. And there are many systems available to rear additional lambs. My preference, if a ewe gives birth to triplets, if she is in good body condition, the lamb, and had taken her 3 lambs, then I would get the ewe to rear them and manage them as a separate group. Artificial rearing is very feasible, and particularly with ad lib feeders, because they improve animal performance, they reduce the amount of labour, they reduce digestive upsets. Wean at approximately, wean when they're over 35 days of age, ideally over 14 kilos, and consuming more than 250 grams of concentrate per lamb daily. Thank you. Hello.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for that, Tim. Huge amount of information covered in a very small amount of time. I have to say it's really interesting seeing it set out to your 85 to 90 kilos of extra concentrate. It's a nice way to look at that. One thing that interested me was you're showing silage on the benefits from performance on D-value, which is interesting because quite often we hear it on ME rather than D-value.
Okay.
So it's interesting. We have got quite a lot of questions. I'm going to pick quick fire a few of these at you. There's one here, and it was actually near the start of when you were speaking about silage, and they're asking about the risk of listeria. So we had quite a catchy summer here in Scotland. I'm sure you did in Ireland as well, where it was less than ideal conditions for making forage, and there would probably be more than average with moles and such like in it this year. How would you treat a potential risky silage if you're feeding your pregnant ewes, especially your triplets?
Well, it depends on whether you're getting it out of a clamp or getting it out of a bale. If I'm getting silage out of a clamp and I also have cattle, the cattle get all the top blocks and they get all the side blocks, and the ewes get anything in the middle. And I think that gets rid of most of the issues with listeriosis. Ideally, I avoid any silage with with any mold going into the yolks, because I would be concerned about it. But there is also some of the white stuff you see in silage can actually be yeast, which is not harmful, and not mold, and vice versa. So you have to be very careful. And I have seen silages coming out of clamps with a fair amount of soil contamination going to large flocks. And once you kept into the middle of the pit, away from the top and away from the sides, there didn't seem to be any issues with listeriosis.
So it's really be careful, and if there's another
Fresh
stock,
silage, no mold, and no evidence of any aerobic deterioration.
and if you do have mouldy silage, find another class of stock to feed it to.
Yes, right.
Another one here is trying to take a bit of you guys' knowledge on housing of sheep, and like there's a lot of folk will put sheep away to winter grazing initially, and then bring them back to house a kind of pre-lambing time. What would be the benefits of actually not worrying about putting them away to grazing and just keeping them at home and feeding them concentrate earlier?
Well, sure, the benefit is if they're away somewhere else, you don't have to be producing the forage on your own farm, and you can probably carry more stock or have a higher stocking rate. The benefits of bringing them home is if you do bring them home, you have to produce silage and you have to be set up to feed it. And if you've got the house in there, it would depend on the cost you're paying for the off grazing as well. I've a number of friends that would be, and we've done a lot of work here before where we've done extended grazing experiments and we did off-farm grazing. It depends on the quality of grass as well. About 15 to 20 years ago, there was great interest in extended grazing where we built up grass in that September, October, and we put the ewes on it in December and we took them off it in February. And what we found in them kind of conditions was that the feed value of the grass started to decline dramatically, we'll say from late November into December and right into January. And once we went into late January, the feed value of the grass that we're feeding to the ewes was equivalent in D-value terms, about a 60 D-value silage, because you're getting lodging in the material and a lot of dead material at the butt. But a lot of people, that's not the type of grass I'd say this person is talking about. This person is talking about just an extra grass probably on a dairy farm, and he's cleaning out the paddocks for a dairy farm, and that's got a high feed value, and I'd have no issue whatsoever with that. And I'd bring home the ewes with 6 to 8 weeks prior to lambing, put them on good silage and start building them into concentrate. We've also done studies where we've looked at ewes where we'd have housed them in mid-pregnancy and put them out to grass in 8 weeks prior to lambing. And if there was plenty of grass ahead of the ewes, we were able to lamb singles and twins without any concentrate supplementation.
There's so many questions here, Tim, and I'm going to just give two more because I'm very aware of time here. There's one around. We've obviously got quite a big push against reducing our inputs and reducing carbon on farms. So when we have triplets, that's obviously it's a lot of feed that's going into both the yow and then the lamb. And I think those birth weights the weaning weights that you showed for the artificially reared lambs really show that concentrate is being hugely beneficial there. What about the use of forage crops and trying to do more from what's grown on the farm rather than importing concentrate feeds? Have you any data on lambs that have gone on to forage crops rather than concentrates?
Forage crops after they were born, or forage crops in late pregnancy?
Late pregnancy.
Yes, we have a small bit of experience of it, but if you're talking about carbon, there's also carbon in growing these crops in fertilizer, and I just stay away from that if I can. If you're talking about triplets versus twins and singles, actually that was reducing the carbon footprint of per kilo of lamb produced, because the biggest expenditure of carbon in a sheep system is actually the ewe herself. So if she rears 3 lambs, she'll have a lower carbon footprint per kilo of lamb carcass produced relative to a ewe that'll only rear 1 or 1.5 to 2 lambs. So I would look at it solely on the economics, what suits your system best, and that's what I would develop it on.
Okay. The last question I'm going to give you is the one I gave to Kathy earlier on, and that was looking at increasing milk protein level through the nutrition to improve lamb survivability. So I think you've largely answered it, but I just wanted to know if there was anything more to add from what
If I was talking to a group of dairy farmers, I would be telling them to increase milk protein because they're getting a bigger economic return per unit of protein relative to fat. And the way you do that is increase the amount of cereals in the diet and also to increase energy intake. But because we're talking here to sheep farmers, I would say that there's two things that are important. Protein may be important, but the most important thing is the milk volume and also the milk fat concentration in the diet, because that is where they're getting the lambs is getting their energy to drive on. So at the end of the day, I would just talk about having as high an ME intake as possible, but prior to lambing, but it has to be cost effective. And there's no point in feeding too much prior to lambing, because if you've got excellent forage, and there's no point in overfeeding concentrate, because we've found with high feed value silage, the concentrate substitution effect can be as high as 0.8 kilos of silage dry matter, reduction in 8.8 of a kilo silage dry matter per kilo increase in concentrate. So there's no benefit whatsoever. But with poor quality silage, you only get a substitution rate of 0.18 or 0.2. So with poor quality silage, it pays to feed concentrate, but with good quality silage, there's no point in going overboard with it. And on all our systems here that I've operated, the post turning out, we would draw concentrate from any ewe that is only reared in 1 or 2 lambs, and any lamb being reared as a single or a twin doesn't get any concentrate supplementation up to the point of slaughter. But the ewes that are reared in triplets, as I said earlier on, they get 0.5 of a kilo of concentrate per head per day for the first 5 weeks, which is 18 to 20 kilos in total, and the lambs get access to a creep feeder with 0.3 of a kilo, which is only 20 kilos per lamb up to the point of weaning, and at weaning concentrate is withdrawn. And to be quite honest, any ewe that is reared an additional lamb is more than entitled to extra 20 to 25 kilos of concentrate for herself, because I would compare her to a cow that's producing 10,000 to 12,000 litres. She's the good cow, the elite.
Well, you think even the weight that she's carrying,
That's right, yeah.
huge, isn't it? It's absolutely
It's
huge.
crazy when you add when people talk about lamb birth weight, we'll say 6 for a single, 5 or 5 for a twin, and 4.7 for a triplet. That doesn't sound much, but now multiply that by 1, 2, and 3. So a triplet will be carrying 14 or 15 kilos of fetus. It's crazy. It's fantastic.
Yes, and then our placenta on top of that as well. It's a
That's
huge
right, yeah.
amount.
Yeah, she loses a lot of weight.
Yes. Fantastic. Thank you very much both.
Thank
I
you.
hope everybody has enjoyed that this evening and has got a whole load of new knowledge of triplets. It would be quite interesting for us, anybody, before you go, if you just put your scanning results into the chat or the Q&A, just to let us kind of see a good spread of the country what scanning results you guys have got. But thank you very much. Thank you to both Kathy and Tim. Thank you to everybody for joining us this evening. Obviously, thank you to our funders, the University Innovation Fund. I have put the links on for next week as well, and the following week after that. So we're looking at reducing inputs. First one will be grass, the next one will be on labour. So please join us in the next couple of weeks. Thank you, folks.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.